Souza as a cloud developer, and I'm the Keystone PTL.
My name is Lance. I'm an engineer at Huawei. I served as Keystone's PTL from Pike through Stine.
So this is what we're going to cover in today's update. We're going to do a brief introduction to what Keystone is, in case you are new to the OpenStack scene and haven't figured out all the components yet. We'll talk about the contributions and contributors in Stine and our team makeup and how that relates to the previous cycle. And then we'll start talking about what we accomplished in the last cycle, and then we'll go into what our proposed plans for the next cycle and beyond that are going to be. And then we'll talk about some of our cross-project initiatives, since Keystone's heavily involved in a lot of things that span across the whole OpenStack project. And then we'll start closing with how you can get involved as a developer or operator or user, and some of the forum sessions and presentations you might be interested in if you're interested in Keystone things. So we'll first talk about what is Keystone. The Keystone project is an implementation of the OpenStack Identity API, and what that means is it's a shared service for authentication and authorization. It's also a broker between OpenStack and other identity services, meaning it acts as a translation layer between things like your LDAP or your Active Directory or other authentication mechanisms like a SAML provider, an OpenID provider, Kerberos, things like that. It's also important to mention it's a discovery service that doesn't really get mentioned enough, I think. It's the way for users to discover what's available in their OpenStack cloud and figure out how to reach them in what region and in what endpoint. I always do that. Now I'll remember to do it. So diving into a little bit more what Keystone does, I remembered. So the obvious thing is it supplies identity information to end users and services. That's what we sort of think of as a Keystone project, but it's also a protective layer for other OpenStack services. We have this middleware layer, and that's what services use to make sure that no unauthenticated users are trying to access it, and make sure that those users get redirected to Keystone so that they can properly authenticate and get authorization. It also facilitates collaboration through multi-tenancy, and what I mean by that is the abstraction that Keystone provides through projects and domains allows us to collaborate as individuals on groupings of virtual resources in isolation from other teams collaborating on other virtual resources, and then we can thereby share physical resources and try to achieve multi-tenancy this way. And then it also emits event notifications for auditing, which is an important part for any kind of intrusion detection system or for doing postmortems on any security incidents.
All right, so we can take a quick look at some of our contributions in Stine. These are compared to the same metrics from the Rocky release. We notice a pretty significant uptick in the number of commits. These are patches that were proposed, reviewed, and landed during the Stine development cycle to any Keystone-related project or repository. We also noticed a slight uptick in the number of people that actually had a patch land, and with more commits, that also drives more reviews, which is part of the reason why you're seeing a 42% increase there from Rocky. Again, just a very slight increase in the number of people actually conducting those reviews. We did notice our core team was reduced by a third. We had a 60% increase in the number of bugs opened against identity-related projects, and we almost doubled the number of bugs that were closed. One thing to note about bugs that were closed, this includes bugs that were invalidated during the triage process or bugs that were closed with a patch to a repository. And then one other thing to note, the increases that you're seeing across commits, reviews, and bugs is partially driven by a very large initiative where we broke a bunch of work across several smaller bugs. This helped us distribute the load more evenly across the team, and it also gave us an opportunity to write more specific patches for those fixes, so making it a little easier on reviewers too. This is another representation of that same data, but it is specific to commits and reviews. This graph is showing the percentage of work done per contributor. So the entire area under the curve accounts for 100% of what was either committed or reviewed in Stine. So starting with reviews, which are in light green, 4 people reviewed 57% of patches merged in Stine, 9 people reviewed 81%. Commits, which tell a very similar story. 4 people authored 55% of all commits that landed in the Stine release, 15 people authored 80%. So once you get past about 6 contributors, the curves are nearly identical. So some of the things that we worked on during the Stine release, right off the bat, the implementation was ready to go, and it was ready to go early. We merged support for Mfa Receipts. If you're unfamiliar with Mfa Receipts, they actually help users step through the authentication process to get a token when they have MFA enabled on their account. So it's a real big plus from a user experience perspective. We also implemented support for a JWS token provider. This adds a little bit of agility to Keystone's token scheme, and it's based on an open standard. So,
and if you want to know more about it,
we'll get there.
we'll be talking about it.
We also implemented support for domain level limits. So you can set limits of resources on domains and then have those limits propagate out to the projects underneath that domain, depending on the enforcement model that you are configuring. And finally, we implemented a ton of stuff around system scope, APIs, and read-only role, specifically applying just default roles across Keystone's API. This actually accounted for the majority of the review bandwidth we had this cycle. The work was spread across more than 100 patches. It was a lot of work and it took a lot of time. It touched almost all of Keystone's APIs. We didn't get around to doing all of them, but we would like you to actually go read the release notes because we're very detailed in explaining which policies we changed, why we changed them, and how you can consume that information. In addition to the code that actually implemented these features, we introduced an additional 947 API protection tests, and these tests exercise the API with 9 different role scope permutations. This is really to help prevent any sort of authoritative regressions in the future.
So I'll talk about some of the things that we have, ideas we have for the train cycle. We'll go into it more at the PTG and start actually finalizing what we want to be working on. But we want to be putting a big focus on application credentials. Application credentials was a feature that landed in the Queen's release, but we want to make it, we want to add some usability features to it. So the first thing that we have is access rules for application credentials, which is a way for, it's a way separate from the main policy feature. It's a way for users to themselves delegate access control rules without relying on the existing policy features that operators control, and allows them to delegate those very fine-grained access rules to their application credentials. So that's something that's going to be coming up and landing pretty soon. We also want to be creating something called Renewable application credentials, which is going to be a way for federated users who have group-only role assignments to be able to delegate those role assignments in a secure way so that the application credentials don't persist after the federated user has been removed from their identity provider or after they lose those role assignments through that group. So that's going to be a huge usability boost for federated users and for edge use cases. We also need to finish up client support for multi-factor auth receipts. We landed all that work on the server side, but we still need to do some work making sure that clients, and especially things like Horizon, can actually consume this properly. We also, as Lance mentioned, we need to be finishing up our implementation of the system scope and the read-only roles on the Keystone side, making sure that all of our APIs understand these different scopes and have this read-only role implementation secured. And then another thing we're considering is implementing immutable resources, making sure that certain resources that are really important to your deployment, like the admin role or the admin user, can't be accidentally deleted or accidentally modified. And this could also be useful down the line if we want to make these things have predictable IDs based on their attributes like their name. We don't want those attributes like their name changing down the line. And then Beyond that, some of the ideas that we have for the future, we're always looking to enhance our support for identity federation, and now starting to work with edge computing groups and making sure that our federation implementation is meeting their use cases and starting to close those gaps for these types of users and helping them build up reference architectures. Along the federation lines, we also see Keystone turning into what we're calling an identity provider proxy, which would be a way for Keystone to take identity information from other external identity providers, other SAML providers, and OpenID Connect providers, and other types of providers, translating that into a common format that can supply identity information both to OpenStack services, but also potentially to services outside of the OpenStack ecosystem, and making that more useful as a standalone component outside of OpenStack. We also want to build on our unified limits implementation. Once we have good support within the rest of the OpenStack project for consuming limit information from Keystone, we'll start working on building out more quota enforcement models, especially for things like reseller use cases, things that we don't have yet. And then one other idea that we have is building on a really old idea of tokenless authentication and reducing being able to reduce the surface attack area for bearer tokens by removing the need for bearer tokens. So building on an old feature that we have, making sure that actually holds up today is something we'd like to be focusing on.
So as always, we have cross-project initiatives where we're working closely with other OpenStack services to introduce consistency across OpenStack. First on that list is the adoption of unified limits. We essentially have all of the plumbing in place from Keystone for services to start consuming this information. The last real big hurdle that we need to work on is firming up the Oslo limit library, because this is really going to be the boundary where services apply limits and enforcement, and then where they get that information from Keystone. Next is properly consuming scope types. Part of the reason why we invested so much time and energy into this effort in Keystone specifically is because we wanted to be our own guinea pig. We've kind of developed all of these tools and concepts, and if we can apply them to our own API and make things a little bit better, we actually do a couple of things. We get the ability to kind of hit those issues first, and then we can actually build out some templates that we can take to other services and say, this is how you're protecting system level APIs, this is how we're doing it, this is how we're protecting project level APIs, this is what you can do if you need to do both. So it gives us a way to communicate with other projects and kind of lead by example. Additionally, default roles are very closely coupled to that. Default role support is going to increase interoperability. It's going to reduce maintenance on operators. It's going to essentially make a lot of the customized policies that we're seeing in real-world deployments first-class citizens. So if there's anything that you've heard us talk about today that you want to get involved with, whether it's a specific initiative or just something in general, we have a number of ways for you to do so. IRC and email are great ways to get a hold of us. We also hold weekly meetings on Tuesdays in IRC. We use bugs for not only bug reports, but we also use them to track feature work. We no longer use Launchpad blueprints. We moved away from that in Stine. Our specification process still exists. Any large body of work needs a spec, any new feature needs a spec, and those are all openly published at specs.openstack.org. We also publish our roadmap, and that's kind of a release thing that we do at the start of every new cycle. And we're also going to be participating in the project teams gathering Thursday through Saturday.
And so if you're interested in learning more, we have some forum sessions. 2 of them happened yesterday, but you can check the Etherpad notes for our forum session on application credentials and our operator feedback session. And then tomorrow we're going to be having more forum sessions, especially with regard to policy, which is going to involve system scope and those default roles. And then working on our unified limits implementation, making sure that is going to be workable for the other OpenStack projects and for operators. And then there's also some presentations that you might be interested in. Unfortunately, some of them already happened, and I think the access control policy wasn't recorded, but we have presentations tomorrow morning, one about federation and one about the new JWS token format. And then if you're interested in getting involved, we really recommend joining the project onboarding, which is going to be tomorrow afternoon. All right, thank you, and we have a few minutes for questions if there are any. All right, thank you so much.